Good afternoon. My name is Dylan Madden. I'm a second-year MSESP student. Thank you all for coming. Under the direction of Secretary Perry, the Department of Energy developed a report to assess the reliability and resilience of the United States electricity grid and an overview of the evolution of the electricity markets. Secretary Perry specifically asked about the cause for recent plant retirements and the impact these have had on grid reliability. The staff report on electricity markets and reliability was released on August 23, 2017. Of many key findings, the report found that low natural gas costs, advancements in natural gas flexibility, and low electric demand growth were principal causes of conventional power plant retirements. Many of the power plants that retired between 2002 and 2016 were used for baseload generation in the past, but they had moved to lower capacity factors and no longer served a baseload function by the time that they retired. Wholesale markets are good at optimizing and delivering basic grid reliability at low cost, but they must evolve to address further reliability and resilience services, as well as extra market interventions and societal valued benefits such as air quality and jobs. The characteristics, metrics, benefits, and compensation for essential resilience and reliability services are not yet still fully understood. Since the report was released, much has been made of Secretary Perry's issuing a notice of proposed rulemaking to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, recommending federal cost of service regulation for baseload generators, primarily ailing coal and nuclear plants. Joining us today to discuss the major factors driving change in the U.S. electricity grid, the challenges regulators face, and what impact Secretary Perry's proposed rule might have, are Greg Gershuni, Managing Director of the Energy and Environment Program at the Aspen Institute, and former Associate Director, Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis, U.S. Department of Energy. Allison Silverstein, Energy Consultant, co-author of the Staff Report of Electricity Markets and Reliability. Mark Templeton, Associate Clinical Professor of Law, Director of the Abrams Environmental Law Clinic at the University of Chicago Law School. And Sam Ori, our moderator, Executive Director of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago and Becker Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago. And with that, Sam, take it away.
Thanks, Dylan. Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you, and thanks for being here with us. We appreciate it greatly. Dylan, I think, kind of got into a little bit of some of the findings of the report and the key themes of the report. But before we even go into that, I thought it might be useful to just kind of take a step back and start at kind of a higher level and maybe a little bit more of a framing conversation about some of the big trends and changes that have occurred in the grid over the last 15 years. Why are we even talking about the grid? What have been some of the big changes, both technological and economic, that have really forced policymakers, I think, to kind of grapple with some of these questions. And so I kind of thought we could start down the line, and maybe Greg, you could kind of kick us off and just identify what you think are some of the big trends and what's the big narrative around the grid and what's changed over the last decade plus.
Sure. So I mean, to even go back a little bit further, we can look at the Fuel Use Act in the late 70s as kind of where a lot of this started, which basically banned the new build of natural gas generation in the U.S. because of shortages in oil and gas after the 1970s oil embargo. And so from there, a lot of coal plants were built, nuclear plants were built, continuing throughout the 80s. And then once the Fuel Use Act ban on natural gas was lifted in the late 80s, natural gas started kind of coming in as more of a generation source instead of just something that heated your homes. And so the U.S. government, Department of Energy, invested a lot of money in developing new sources of oil and natural gas, and that led to George Mitchell inventing or marketing fracking as a way to pull new oil and gas out of the ground. And then in the mid-2000s, natural gas prices, they were high and then they dropped as we kind of got closer to 2010. And so that created a big opening for natural gas to come in as a generation source. Meanwhile, and I can stop in a second, but meanwhile, over the last 7 or 8 years, renewable power, solar, utility scale solar, and onshore wind kind of came into its own. The price has been dropping every year. It's now cheaper to build new wind plants than it is to build a new coal or natural gas plant. It's now just as cheap to build a new utility scale solar plant as it is to build a fossil fuel plant. And so those have been taking up more and more of a percentage of a kind of a flat generation mix. And so that's kind of how I see the last couple of decades gone.
Great. So I'm going to start with an even longer arc for a second, which recognizing that not people here may be interested in energy, but not necessarily understand the public utility model and kind of where we are today. But I'm going to make it very short and sweet, which is right here in Chicago, Samuel Insull, who ran Commonwealth Edison, really pioneered the development of the central station model. And so originally, 100 years ago, plus years ago, when each essentially major building or factory had its own power plant, he essentially rolled them and the smaller power plant operators into a central station, and thereby achieved huge economies of scale. These plants then became more monopolists and became regulated by the states. In Illinois, it's the Illinois Commerce Commission, but typically by public service commissions, public utilities commissions. Over time, and they really served a specific geographic area where they did both the generation, the transmission from those plants to the ultimate distribution to the customers, right? So a highly integrated model. Over the kind of coming decades, we then moved to a situation where there were more arm's length transactions and the development of independent power generators. We also then moved to a situation where you've got markets for wholesale power and the development of regional transmission organizations and independent system operators. And in many ways, we have this very interesting kind of architecture of regulation that's taking place by FERC of wholesale markets and transmission, the historic state regulation, this kind of at least being a lawyer, we think of state and federal, but you've got this intermediate level of markets being run by the regional transmission organizations. And we've got this very complicated kind of evolution of governing structures into which these technological changes and legal changes have had to fit, including things like really the explosion of state renewable portfolio standards, where states, whether they're legislatures or through referendum by the public, have said we want a certain percentage of our electricity in our state to come from renewable sources. What that is debatable at the margin, but certainly includes wind and solar, and has created a requirement in many places, some places a goal, for there to be more production and bringing of those kinds of resources onto the grid. With these goals and targets never really going down, but going up over time. So you see more of these resources kind of coming up as the economics are changing and as there's political requirements being imposed, more and more of these sources coming on. And so I think that is another big set of trends, kind of the larger movement towards markets, and then thinking about how do you integrate these kinds of resources. Got it.
So they've given you the outside observer looking back viewpoint, and I will give you was there in the middle of it, making it happen from the start, got the t-shirt version. Because or actually it's not just one t-shirt, it's a whole stack. Because my entire career has been living through these and helping to make them happen. I started working at Pacific. I didn't start working at Pacific Gas and Electric, but when I started working at Pacific Gas and Electric, it was, I think, maybe 83 or 84. And I was in the rate department working on transmission and distribution and helping make conservation and load management, as we called it then, happen. And also working on standard offer 4 contracts and how do you implement the qualified facilities purchasing contract designs for what were then brand new qualifying facilities under the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act of 82, 80.
78.
Thank you. Phew. And PG&E at the time had the nation's leading research and development department. We were next door to we were next door to EPRI, and we were thought to be one of the leading strategic thinkers in the industry. We were grappling, and at the time, but we were also fairly forward in things like advancing energy efficiency. Sorry, later term. Conservation load management, and California was very aggressive in developing appliance efficiency standards and auto efficiency standards and getting out ahead in the idea that saving energy was a good thing, particularly because we had just finished building, we had pictured demand growing inexorably for decades to come, and we would be looking at a string of nuclear power plants along the Pacific to match our existing fleet of of oil and gas plants. And we had just finished, or were about to finish construction on a nuclear power plant that sadly turned out to be sitting on top of a seismic fault, which is not a really good thing if you're a utility. And sort of chills you on the enthusiasm to keep building more nuclear plants because you've got so much capital invested in this one that won't come online and you're not getting any money for it. So that was one of the reasons PG&E was such a big fan of, first off, saving electricity rather than building more, investing more capital in generation, and why PG&E and its neighbors to the south, SoCal Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric, were big on north-south trade up to British Columbia to leverage we all then had a lot of hydro every spring and a lot of snowpack. Those days are gone. So there was a big north-south trade seasonal. We would ship up, they would ship down hydro and we would ship up nuclear and excess power, and it was life was good and easy. Well then, I worked on Earth Day. I was the news rep on site for the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1998. So that was my first taste of resiliency issues. We also had a significant amount of wildfires. I worked on at R&D on advanced integrated energy efficiency and on a variety of pipeline integration issues and development of the early distributed utility concepts, including what were then the forerunners of how do we make energy efficient appliances and home designs work together and complement each other in an integrated fashion, and how could we use these, and how could we use things like, I don't think we'd invented the term demand response, but the idea, since PG&E was one of the pioneers of PV and of wind development, sucking up a great deal of the money that DOE was investing in R&D. So all of that was a really fun time. My family moved to Austin, Texas, and I answered an ad in the classifieds. Y'all may not have seen a newspaper in a couple of decades. But when I moved to Texas, there were still classified ads, and I was one of 300 applicants to resumes that came into a young guy who was a baby commissioner at the Public Utility Commission of Texas, named Pat Wood, who was working for new Governor George Bush. And I ended up getting hired to be Pat Wood's advisor. Commissioner Wood became Chairman Wood. This was, I think, 95. And in the following 6 years, we designed and implemented wholesale competition for electricity, retail competition for electricity, the nation's first renewable portfolio standard, the nation's first REC trading program, REC design and trading program, the first distributed generation rule that linked not only DG interconnection to an emissions standard, pollution standard. We set up retail competition. We set up, telecom competition, just by the by, and did Y2K and a couple of other things, odds and ends. And then in 2001, Governor Bush became President Bush, and Wood and I went to Washington to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where, hey, John, where I became effectively chief of staff, and he was chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. You've heard about the differences between FERC and state regulators. The thing I should tell you is that the fun of being in Texas is Texas has its own interconnection. So FERC ain't the boss of us, and it's a good thing. At FERC we worked on and set up, they had already come up with the idea of RTOs, of reliability coordinators and wholesale market operations through centralized markets. We put that on steroids. PJM was already up and running, and New York and New England were kind of there, and we moved a lot of that much farther, much faster, set up a whole lot of the market rules. What else? Did the first major rules to make it possible for renewables to interconnect to the grid with much less interference on the part of the utilities. Incumbent transmission companies made it possible for transmission companies to go independent instead of facilitated a lot of lived through the divestiture of a lot of the utility-owned generation from transmission, so that you couldn't have the utilities favoring their affiliated generators, and facilitated a lot of the spread of independent renewables development. At the same time, DOE was running a very aggressive R&D program. One of my best friends was the guy who ran the R&D program and that designed and commercialized the development of the Frame 7 engine, which is the turbine that essentially took what was a jet turbine and turned it into something that made natural gas generation cheap and fast and flexible. So that was essentially what created a significant amount of the QF market, and what enabled competitive generation to take off. These were the days when that enabled the shift from utilities always building the next bigger, badder plant, because economies of scale were the way you got things cheaper. And once we had the ability to extend transmission thanks to FERC open market rules and smaller generators that were cheaper, all of a sudden that completely significantly transformed the market. Also having competitive centralized markets, we still have maybe only 10% of electricity perhaps is traded through each of the ISO RTO markets. And the rest of it is self-scheduled, like you own it and you generate it for your own purposes. But all of that generation is marked to and priced at what is the prices in the market. So the importance of centralized markets and then add on the whole IT thing has completely shifted the way that markets and electricity are priced and traded, and enabled the bigger spread of high voltage transmission with design and construction managed and to some degree adjudicated or negotiated by RTOs and ISOs, has really enabled a lot of the trade and the market stuff and the renewables that we're talking about today. Oh, by the way, I left FERC. I'm almost done, I promise. So I left FERC and while I was at FERC, I also ran the US-Canada blackout investigation and wrote that report. So if you're looking for a walk down memory lane, that's another little resiliency opportunity to examine. And then became an independent consultant in 2004, moved back to Texas so my kids could go to high school where they belonged. And since then, I have worked on and written all of the Department of Energy National Transmission Congestion Studies. This is my greatest hits recitation here. I'm on the board of the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. I'm also on the board of the Health Alliance for Austin Musicians, but that's probably not germane. And the three most interesting things I've done for a while are running the North American Synchrophaser Initiative. The importance of synchrophasers is that it's one of the most important opportunities for smart grid in the transmission space, but the substitution of software and intelligence and communications for hardware, for steel on the ground, is critical in transforming everything that happens on the grid. I ran and wrote the study that recently caused Bonneville Power Administration to decide that they don't need to build another 500 kV line from Seattle to Portland to solve capacity and reliability problems. And in May, the Department of Energy called and said, can you spare a couple weeks? So that's my story. And
Excellent.
that's how all the ways the grid changed.
So I think we heard a lot there across our three panelists. And so it seems to me, so you guys covered technology changes, declining technology costs, the advent of the shale gas revolution and the advent of cheap natural gas on the grid, markets, a whole variety of regulatory and policy changes. I guess, so two things. One, I think just to kind of summarize how all that has and hasn't affected the actual grid, right? So what have we seen? We've seen from 2005 to today, coal generation fall from 53% of net electricity generation in the US down to the high 30s now. We've seen a concurrent increase in gas generation by 15 or 16 percentage points up to the low 30s, an increase in renewable generation. And so the grid, the way that we get power has changed a little bit over the last 10 or 15 years. And then the one thing that maybe we didn't talk as much about is climate and regulation, federal regulation and state regulation. Mark, you mentioned RPS, but at the federal level, there's been a host of other actions that did impact the grid, I think, and some that were poised to potentially impact the grid, but ultimately have not, not gone into action, like the Clean Power Plan. But maybe, Greg, there's been a few, I think, regulatory changes as well.
Sure. So in 2013, and this was when I was moving from the White House to the Department of Energy, President Obama put out the President's Climate Action Plan, which was a suite of policy actions aimed to reduce carbon emissions in the United States. The kind of the jewel in the crown of this was the Clean Power Plan, which the EPA put out. I guess this was August of 15. The final rule was put out, and would have lowered emissions in the U.S. about 32 to 33% by 2030. And so what it basically called for this is the Clean Air Act 111B and 111D. It called for states to put together plans that would lower emissions by a certain amount. Each state had a specific goal. Some states had larger goals, some states had smaller goals, but to use all available resources to do that. And so once the goal was assigned, they could do anything they wanted to comply with the rule, but they just had to meet those emissions by 2030, and it would have gone into effect in 2022. In the new administration, they've repealed that rule, or at least they're in the process of doing that. But states have kind of started down that road, and utilities have started down that road, and I think that a lot of utilities and a lot of states are still going to continue to go down that road. On the other side of this, and so when we talk about climate change and decarbonization, I know this is sort of outside the scope of this, so we're focused on electricity, but the transportation sector is now the biggest source of carbon emissions in the United States. And so the CAFE standards that EPA puts out are also now being rediscussed. The midterm evaluation of that is happening. California is going to play a very large role in determining whether or not the more stringent standards in the mid-20s are going to stand. And so I think those are kind of the big things that were.
Okay, and Aside from just, I guess, the climate stuff, there's also been some pollution regulations designed to deal with NOx and SOx and those kinds of things that have mercury, right?
I think there's certainly a debate, and you see people on different sides. Is it driven by market forces? Is it driven by regulation?
Right.
I think you can almost look plant by plant at some of this, but I think in a sense that some of the environmental regulation, if some of these plants were kind of already old and out of the money, or close to being out of the money anyway, and then you're looking at, okay, do you want to put in the necessary controls to deal with these environmental pieces? That could have been the tipping point.
And I think we're going to talk more about this in just 2 minutes, because the study, I think, had something to say about that as well. But before we get to that, I guess the one other thing that I wanted to ask about is, as we talked about all the changes in the grid, I think there have been some benefits, but there's also been some challenges that as the grid has evolved, that I think everyone agrees that there are things that we need to consider in terms of potentially the future of the grid. And I wondered if Allison, if you want to talk a little bit about what are some of the big issues that have cropped up. I think setting aside anything, the narrower set of issues that I think the study was designed to address. I mean, even before the study was commissioned, FERC had already kind of kicked off this process to talk about capacity markets and some of those kinds of things. So, and you also brought up transmission, and I think we've seen some real challenges with transmission. So, just at a high level, what are some of the challenges that the changes in the grid have brought about?
I'll tell you what. I don't know that they're all challenges, but I'll tell you what the major topics of whining are. The first is, if you're an integrated utility, you want to whine about the potential for competition and the potential for stranded assets. You have spent a lot of your ratepayers' money, by God, on big expensive capital for generation and or transmission and or distribution that is sized to do specific things and to deliver power in certain directions to specific loads. And if those loads disappear, or if those generators disappear, you are at risk for stranded assets. And that means that you don't get all of the capital back potentially that you spent, or you don't get all of the, you don't make a profit. Or if your sales drop, as is happening in California due to community aggregation, this is all of these customers that were your captives that you could sell to. Then all of a sudden they might not buy from you, and you run the risk of not being paid back for all the money that you've spent on them. So stranded assets is a big issue, whether it's transmission or generation or distribution. One of the other so stranded assets not getting repayment. Competition generally. If you own generators, you don't want competition from independent producers. If you own generators, you don't want competition from energy efficiency or from PV on rooftops, or from, and if you own coal or nuclear plants, you don't want competition from cheaper, faster gas or nuclear. If you, these are not, you remember the line from Roger Rabbit from Jessica, who says, "I'm not bad, I'm just drawn that way." This is who they are. This is what they're designed to and planned and drawn to care about. This is the rules that they live by and what have made them successful. And it is not easy to be an adult and have to change. Let's just get right clear on that now. Whether it's as a person or as a company or as whatever. It's just change is hard, and figuring out where and how to change effectively is hard. So there's that. Then there is retail competition, which is I had this very nice, happy set of captive customers, and now other people can come in with different business models and shark them away from me. I think about 20 states in the country have some form of retail competition. Texas is broadly thought to be one of the most effective of those, where you can offer all kinds of alternate plans, and the wires companies, the utilities become effectively a wires company. And so you have to design a whole alternate set of rates to keep wires companies whole. Competition from energy efficiency. And because we used to have electricity demand growing consistently with GDP, and that has decoupled since about 2008. But it went down in California much before that, but in 2008 with the recession, essentially stomped on electric growth, and then the magic of LEDs and the accumulated decades of energy efficiency for appliances and buildings before then finally kicked in. So now we've had electric demand be almost entirely flat everywhere but Texas since 2008, and GDP's kept going up. So those are all the things that you are going to be angsty about, apart from reliability and resiliency. And then there are the what happens in the next emergency, what happens if this price goes down versus that price goes down, how do I deal with a new regulation? How do I deal with the whole change in intelligence and the security risks around cyber or solar flares and geomagnetic disturbances? If you are an electric industry executive, you do not sleep well at night. There are so many things that you should be worrying about, including new business models.
Well, could I just add? But
Yeah.
that's partly, I mean, isn't that partly because you are still thought of as the provider of last resort, and that you get, and I know we're talking about innovation here, but you're going to get raked before the State Public Service Commission and the politicians are going to blast you. So not only are you you've got the legacy of that, but there is still some real current incentives to make them worry about those things.
The job of running an electric company used to be like watching football. There's just 10 minutes of excitement, but most of it is just hours and hours. It's just dull as can be, and it's business as usual, and it's no big deal.
I don't know if everybody would agree with that characterization.
Football.
Maybe golf. That's why there's NFL Red now, so you can just get to the excitement anyway.
Well, I think I understand your point.
So the people who went into running utilities were the Eagle Scouts. You're ready for anything. You've got all the details handled, and it's just grind it out. Not a big deal. Plan for the worst and avoid risk. There's a lot more worse and a lot more risk, and a lot more ways that it can go south on you.
So I guess, and I would just add one thing to that list that you guys kind of ran through, which I think is great, which is it seems to me that there's a emerging kind of conversation, I guess, or focus on the layers of state policies in markets, and that these layers of state policies are in some cases creating some very unusual market outcomes where you have negative pricing and some of these kinds of things that are affecting generators in markets. And there, I think, has been some very legitimate question about, well, what does that mean for especially baseload power plants, and how do we value capacity and some of those kinds of questions. And then kind of taking a step back, I guess, there was during the campaign, and this will kind of lead us into the study, there was a whole series of questions around, I think coal, the previous administration's policy on coal, and even if you set aside the high-level rhetoric about the war on coal and coal mining and coal jobs, there was kind of also a series of conversations about the reliability of the grid and what was happening to the grid as a result of the previous administration's policies around the Clean Power Plan and some of that kind of stuff. And so fast forward to early 2017, Secretary Perry was confirmed in March, and a month later, roughly in April, issued this memorandum commissioning a study on electricity markets and reliability. And I made just a couple of little underlines and notes on on the actual original memo. And in it he says that baseload power is necessary to a well-functioning electric grid, and that over the past few years, grid experts have expressed concerns about erosion of critical baseload resources. Still others have highlighted the diminishing diversity of our nation's electric generation mix, and what that could mean for baseload power and also grid resilience, and that this has resulted in part from regulatory burdens introduced by the previous administration's policies. He mentions the market distorting effects of subsidies. And so with that letter, commissioned this study. and which Allison, which you led the writing of. So I guess tell us what did the study find, just at a high level? What were some of the key findings about those kinds of issues?
Let me clarify what my role is, because it's important to understand the difference between what the study found and what the study said.
What the study found and what DOE said.
That's a very
There you go.
lawyerly response.
I've been practicing this. Welcome to my 15 minutes of fame. I was called up in mid-May, yes, over 5 weeks into a 60-day study, and asked if I would consider coming to DOE to lead research and writing of the study. And after I finished laughing, I agreed to listen to the pitch, and ended up saying yes, even though they asked me to be embedded at DOE for the process. And I said, do you think we'll be able to get an extension past the first 60 days? And they said probably. So I showed up and I said, we do this on my terms. And you don't know me, but my terms weren't particularly pleasant, and I'm not a very nice person. So
Well, given your remarks about football, I don't know.
you don't doubt that at all. What I did was essentially rip up their original outline that they had put together for what to do. Rick Perry does not know me, and I can guarantee you he doesn't want to at this point. But the guys at DOE at the staff level did know me because we'd worked together on all these other studies, and they figured I was one of the only people who could stare down all of the DOE staffers who wanted to explain what the answer is, and what I would tell them, and that I could put together a coherent story. So I essentially became the person who organized the research, and I sent these little squads of analysts, probably some of whom used to work for him, off to and said, get me everything you can on this, find me everything on that. I had some fabulous people at EIA running numbers for me and putting together graphics. And although the Perry memo had framed this as the sky started falling in 2011, I said this really needs to go back to 2000 or 2002 because of so many pivotal changes in the industry. And that was probably one of the most significant things that I did that turned out to make the difference of night and day in terms of answering the questions. EIA had good data back to 2002 that let us cover the impacts of electric competition, the drop in natural gas prices, the flattening of demand, the growth of renewables, and the growth of gas generation, and, oh, by the way, all the regulations that affected the coal and nuclear generation. We didn't mention explicitly, a lot of the nuclear issues were exacerbated by the EPA's Waters of the U.S. regulations, which caused increased cooling costs. We didn't even, so I did all of this research and writing, and I was listed as the co-author. What I wrote was, or you called me the co-author. I was the guy who did all the writing, and then I left but what I wrote was the guts of the technical study. And then I left town on July, my last day at DOE was July 7. I left town on the 8th, and then DOE kept it for another 7 weeks, and I had no idea what would happen to it. When it came out, DOE had written the policy recommendations. I had actually organized a process for let's develop everything that isn't just batshit crazy as a potential policy recommendation. That might have been part of what was leaked in the June 23rd version. And what I wanted to do was have them be open-minded. And then, so DOE took ownership of the policy recommendations. They wrote the summary of findings, which was kind of related to the body of the technical study. And they wrote the cover letter, which was kind of related. It used words like baseload and reliability. And what DOE mostly did was pretty up the graphics and mush up some of the language in the technical study. So what the technical study findings that you should conclude from what the include the following. The primary causes of coal and nuclear retirements were wholesale competition works. It did exactly what it was supposed to. It shut down inefficient plants. It shut down unneeded stuff. It made it much clearer that you don't piss away good money after bad. If prices are going to keep falling and you're not in the game, get out early. With one exception that we'll get to in a minute. The flattening of demand makes it impossible to keep building on the come. Although if you're a gas plant owner and you have a Harvard finance degree, you don't seem to grasp that oversupply is a challenge for you personally because you always think you're smarter than all those other jackasses out there and your plant's going to be cheaper. Turns out that's not the case. But so there's a lot of finance guys getting their clocks cleaned in the gas market still. But overall, what this has done has been a very orderly transition in terms of the cheaper stuff is winning. And the faster stuff is winning, which is the way it ought to work. Gas prices fell hugely by a third after 2008, 2009, which is when people started actually discovering that the whole shale thing wasn't just sort of some anomaly, that shale was real and cheap gas was inescapable. And what that meant was a complete sort of transition of permanent pushing down real prices of generation. And the last thing was competition, demand, gas prices.
Reliability?
Thank you. Well,
Regulation?
no. There were four. I'll get back to them. Here's what they weren't. Renewables made life worse for classic generators. Oh, one of the most important findings, baseload is not a kind of plant, it's a function. There's nothing special about coal and nuclear. Coal and nuclear have the problems. Oh, I know what it was. The most important thing, the coal and nuclear plants that retired were old, really old, and really inefficient. And they had earned their AARP cards, and it was time for them to get off the playing field and go enjoy a nice afterlife somewhere. So renewables did not, a whole lot of these plants retired well before renewables got big. What renewables have done is make the grid significantly faster, in combination, by the way, with IT and communications, so that, and the ability of customers to manage their loads better, so that we now have a much faster moving grid, and coal and nuke can't move that fast. And in fact, coal plants, most of them are middle-aged at best today, and they just, their costs, operating costs and maintenance costs and heat rates get much higher. Across the board, the more they have to cycle or ramp. And nuclear plant, what you want to do is turn it on and walk away and come back 18 months later and refuel it. You don't want to cycle that puppy at all. And so none of them, they cannot provide the essential resiliency and reliability services that we need, like voltage support, reg up, reg down, primary frequency response, secondary frequency response, all kinds of stuff. Coal and nuclear plants just are not good at anything but spinning reserve. And local voltage support, they can't do black start, they can't do anything, except generate electricity that was once cheap and now ain't so cheap relative to the other stuff. And then regulation, I got to actually DOE and I sent up a storyboard and I started writing, and they called me in one day and they said, there's nothing in here about regulation and the horrible effects of regulation on all these plants. I said, well, it wasn't a big deal. And they said, but you're biased against regulation. And I said, bring me the data. I've been in the building 3 or 4 weeks now. You guys are the ones who own the issue. Prove to me, bring me all of your research about how regulation has killed these. Well, we don't have any. Then how am I supposed to do this? So I looked a lot into regulation, and here's what I discovered. The early days of all of the Obama administration regulations that had said, everybody said the sky is falling, we're going to have to fix all these plants simultaneously, the world will fall apart as we know it. Not so much. It turns out that when people have to actually do a job, they find cheaper ways to do it. Many of the sites that you see from the coal industry today about how expensive it is to fix these plants were published before, like 1914. Try 2014 or so, 2013, from the sky is falling before it happens stage, and EIA analysis has indicated that in fact significantly fewer plants had to close, and a lot of the modifications for these regs were done faster and cheaper instead of the whole disaster that people had anticipated. So I mentioned the linkage between regulation and retirements. It is this. When the administration says all of these plants closed in 2015, that proves regulation caused it. Well, the answer is these guys made a perfectly logical economic operations decision, and they said it doesn't make sense to spend more money on a plant that's already out of the money, to retrofit. So what I'm going to do, and they decided this in like 2013, I'm going to do the Thelma and Louise strategy. I'm going to, that regulation date, the compliance deadline, is the edge of the cliff. And I'm just going to gun it and run this flat out as fast as I can and get every possible kilowatt hour I can before I have to shut it down. Boom. And go out in a blaze of glory, literally. So that's why you saw all of those retirements at that deadline. It's just common sense operational strategy. Don't piss away money.
And so, I guess two things. One is, when I said reliability, I took note of the other point that was made in the study, that grid operators generally continue to assess the grid as having adequate reliability.
More than adequate. We've had a lot of the classic reliability definitions that NERC uses are around reserve margin, and most of the regions of the country are in an oversupply situation. Even with renewables derated for capacity purposes, we still have a whole lot of capacity that's over the classic reliability level reserve margins across most of the country. ERCOT is just about to go under or close to that level because of the shocker, the retirement of 3 more coal plants is coming up. But you know, the best cure for overcapacity is low prices. And we're getting it. So retirements happen because of low prices, and then people come in and they build more. Or in this case, they figure out how to do more of the smarter stuff, which is going to be more PV, more demand response, more energy efficiency, more integration and management of customer side assets, so that you do things like use the building as a battery with so smart demand response and integrated storage, so that instead of expecting the supply side to solve the entire problem, you're starting to enlist the demand side as a partner to solve this.
And so, you know, that's the technical component of the study. As you said, then there was both a series of policy recommendations and then also areas for further study that were at the end of the document. And the policy recommendations, I think, you know, first of all, the study as a whole was widely viewed as, I think, technically proficient, and that it covered a wide variety of. So I think it's important to say that there were, you know, look, there were a lot of people that were concerned about when the study was first commissioned what it was going to look like, and I think in the end people looked at the study and said, "Whoa, this seems to be kind of a ho-hum, kind of like very wonky."
You can imagine my relief when people called me up and said, "Hey, that doesn't suck."
And so then there were the policy recommendations and the areas for further study. And you know, the policy recommendations, it seemed to me, took on a lot of legitimate issues. Some of the things around negative pricing and market structure and competing policies. That I remember at the time being asked if I thought there were any areas that that would be interesting to kind of keep an eye on over the ensuing months. And one was when you went into the areas for further study. There was this line that argued for exploring ways to compensate generators for desired grid attributes. And I think you could probably draw a pretty straight line between that and the NOPR that ultimately was recommended. So I guess the two things I want to do is, one, maybe Greg, you could help us kind of understand, or Mark, what the process is and why when DOE wanted to action or implement some of the items from the study, or from their recommendations, I should say, in the areas for further study, why did that go to FERC? What does that process look like? And then maybe help us understand a little bit what does the NOPR say that it's trying to do?
Sure. So let me just start out by saying, I'll use an example from the Quadrennial Energy Review, which was the report that I worked on when I was at the Department of Energy, and kind of the process for how we took the great ideas from the staff at DOE and kind of turned them into policy recommendations, because I think that's a good example of how this happens. And basically, I mean, what we do is we solicit ideas from the analysts and the staff and the national labs for policy recommendations. You know, we put together issues, we put together policy recommendations, and then we kind of feed it up through the food chain, where the director of policy for the department looks at it and, you know, sorts through them. The secretary looks at things. We consult with the White House. We consult with EPA. We consult with other agencies. Now, FERC and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission are independent, and so there's a different relationship there. But one of the authorities that the Secretary of Energy has is the ability to put something on the FERC schedule. Allison, you can kind of clarify on that. But
no prior secretary had ever used that authority.
It had never been done before. We had talked about doing it, but it never rose to the level of needing to do that while I was at the department. But it is something that exists out there that the Department of Energy lawyers know about and have looked at over time, and but it had never been used until this year. But what normally would happen is the leadership of the Department of Energy would talk with the leadership of FERC in kind of the regular meetings that they would have, and talk through ideas and see what's reasonable and what's kind of rational to kind of pass along.
No, go ahead. I mean,
And so I think when you look at reports like the Quadrennial Energy Review, the recommendations that make it into a report like that are both, you know, evaluated on an analytical level by the staff of the office that's putting them together. They're talked about with the White House and the White House leadership who makes the energy policy, and that includes people from the Domestic Policy Council, the National Economic Council, the National Security Council, Office of Science and Technology Policy. And then you talk about it with the Office of Management and Budget, because almost everything costs money to do. And so whether it's a regulation that has to go through OIRA, which is the office that oversees all regulations in the federal government, or it has to be put into the budget for the next year for the president's budget to send to Congress, it has to be approved by, or has to be run through the Office of Management and Budget. And so there's a long process for doing things like this. And I can't speak to the NOPR that Secretary Perry announced a few months ago, but that's kind of the traditional way that policy is made in the federal government, at least on energy.
And so, okay, so that's kind of how it ended up at FERC.
But the other thing is that FERC has the ability to order industry to do things, and all DOE has is money.
Right.
So DOE can issue policy statements that have limited impact, and DOE can issue grants, which require a significant amount of political hand-wringing and OMB approval. So the most effective way, so DOE couldn't say, you must do this. The only thing that they had to do, the only way they could make something happen was to ask FERC to do this.
Yeah, the only regulatory authority that DOE has is energy efficiency regulations, and that's relative. I mean, that didn't apply here. So.
And so, what did DOE ask FERC to do exactly?
No, it's okay.
DOE asked her. I was nowhere near this. In fact, there were probably no more than 4 or 5 people within DOE who actually worked on this, and there were probably way more than that who tried to convince DOE that it was a really bad idea. And it got cooked up long after I was back in Texas cooling my heels. So DOE shipped over this NOPR that said, as though they had never read the DOE staff reliability report, coal and nuclear plants provide, and baseload plants, because they didn't read the report, continue to retire at an appalling rate, and if we lose them, we will be losing essential pieces that provide critical reliability services and critical resiliency services to the grid. And we know that these are incredibly valuable for the grid because coal and nuclear plants played an important role during the polar vortex of 2014 when a bunch of gas plants stopped being able to serve, ignoring the fact that we had very carefully explained that as many coal and nuclear plants shut down because were not available to serve during the polar vortex. And polar vortices are not, last time I checked, the only bad things that happen on the grid. And by the way, in case you haven't heard about it, the Rhodium group did a really nice study that said only 0.000, there might be another zero in there, 7% of outages of actual customer outage hours experienced on the grid are due to lack of fuel availability.
Yeah, 0.00007.
Okay, so I might have gotten the number O's right, we're not sure. It's a small number. Most of the huge bulk of the problems that customers actually experience for outages are due to transmission and distribution problems. And you can't do enough tree trimming to prevent them all. Believe me, I've advocated it. So what DOE said in the NOPR was, so look, the best way to protect these precious plants is to is that we must set up cost of service pricing regulation for power plants that have 90 days of fuel on site, because they're calling this fuel security. And this only applies to plants that are not already cost of service regulated by a state and that are in a competitive wholesale centralized market. When you translate all of that, essentially what it means is coal and nuclear plants that used to be owned by utilities that got divested and turned into merchant plants in the fat days when coal and nuke were cheap and gas was expensive, and before renewables ruined the party. So all of these made a bunch of money for about 5 years when they were merchant plants, and then gas prices started plummeting and these guys started getting more expensive. And then in printing the NOPR, they threw in not just energy markets, competitive energy markets, but also capacity markets. So effectively, this applies to coal and nuclear plants that are merchant, that are in PJM and MISO. And by the way, most coal plants today only keep 45 to 70 days of fuel, because it's crazy to keep a huge inventory, particularly in places like, by the way, during Hurricane Harvey, the coal plants in Houston got flooded and you can't burn wet coal, so we had to crank up the gas plants. So all of that fabulous on-site fuel supply didn't do us much good. So that's what they sent over, and they said, and by the way, you should figure out how to implement this give us a decision on whether you're going to implement it within 60 days. The Administrative Law and Procedures Act has a few things to say about the advisability of doing something that quickly. Did I miss anything important?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think
It's kind of like stepping in the Wayback Machine, right? We're just going to like unwind all of these things that have been done for these,
right. Well, I guess, and a question that I've had about it, which probably doesn't have a technical answer, is why you wouldn't just rely on, why you wouldn't turn to this process that FERC has been convening with independent system operators around capacity markets. And if your goal is to essentially, if your goal was to address what I suspect is a very legitimate and important issue of, or at least a question of, should we be valuing capacity? And if we're going to be having plants run below their nameplate capacity, and that's going to affect their business model, shouldn't we be figuring out, or is it worth? Should we be figuring out some way to compensate the owners of capacity to continue to make that available?
I'm going to answer, I apologize for bogarting this, y'all, but I'm going to give that two different answers.
Yep.
The first question is why, and why would they propose this? And the second question is, should this be about capacity? And my answer on why would they propose this is, if you work for an administration that is making a big deal about helping coal, and you have a lot of senior staff people who don't have a significant amount of expertise either about the industry or about the administrative and policy issues that you are dealing with, I think what you do is say, heck, we'll send over something that's a Hail Mary, does all the right political stuff to help coal and nuclear. We'll be the heroes, and it's FERC's job to do the dirty work. So Perry and his team look, well, you know, they're doing all the right things for the cause. And if it works, great. If it doesn't work, it's someone else's fault. So I think that's just the raw political answer. Yeah. So that's the first question. Your second question is, how do we keep capacity? And the answer, the Alison Silverstein answer is, this is no longer a game about capacity. Capacity was relevant in the days when demand was always growing and when customers only consumed. And there was none of this two-way or none of this sophisticated control. And it was always about another big power plant, another big transmission line. Today, and the grid moved really, really slowly, and you didn't have to cycle or ramp plants much. Or you couldn't substitute demand or behind-the-meter generation for, or demand response for supply. But today, it is about energy, and it's about location, and it's about time and a level of precision and speed that is unprecedented. So it's no longer a capacity game, and we are wasting a tremendous amount of money buying capacity, which is the wrong thing. And what we need to be buying is much more location and time-specific energy, and we need to be getting it on a technology-agnostic basis, and we need to be recognizing and valuing things that promote and affect reliability and resiliency. A lot of stuff like voltage support is not compensated today, but there's a lot of assets that can provide it and don't, because I don't get money, why should I provide it? We need to figure out metrics and products around voltage, around black start, around reg up, reg down, around I'm running out of steam, I apologize. So there's a whole lot of features, ramp speed, cycling. Cycling means you turn on and off, ramping means you move it up and down and how fast you do it. So we need to be having a whole lot of precision around those, and we need to be figuring out what they're worth and how to pay for them. And we need to be very specific about asking for that instead of just dumb capacity, because dumb capacity rewards things like old coal plants.
Right.
Thank you, I apologize for the rant.
No. So I guess one or two more questions, and then I want to hear from all of you. But it's a question. This a lot of the evidence when we talk about reliability, the rhodium study, for example. I mean, it's looking at stuff over the last 4 years or 5 years, and you know, I think a lot of the discussion that we've had so far, we're drawing on the evidence of what we've seen over the last few years, and we're saying, well, you know, some of these concerns don't really seem to hit the mark. I guess a interesting question might be, as we look to the future, if we take it for granted that a lot of what's been driving changes in the grid have been market forces and continued technological change in the cost of PV modules. It seems like every day we see a new estimate of how fast the costs for wind generation are dropping. What are some of the things that we should be looking to, you know, 4, 8, 10, 15 years from now in terms of big challenges for the grid? I mean, I think you've started to get into some of them, Allison, but I don't know, Greg or Mark, if you guys have thoughts.
Sure. I don't know if this is a challenge for the grid day to day, but I think how quickly and to what extent are we going to be electrifying our transportation system, and to what extent is that going to require new sources of power. Now, I think the thing about that, though, is that we read a lot about, and Allison and Greg may have views too, about how you can charge at certain times and discharge at other times. So again, back to kind of the IT piece of this, right? It's on the one hand a huge demand, but the importance of time and location, I think, are going to be really critical with the IT systems. I think that we have to be thoughtful and kind of more targeted, right? So in the sense of, where are the EVs going to be ramping up first, right? I mean, if they're more expensive, they're going to be ramping up in certain areas first. You get more of a demand in certain parts of the grid. The local distribution system is part of that. So it's not just kind of what the grid can handle more generally, but we have to kind of look at it on a more nuanced kind of basis.
But from a legal and regulatory perspective, I would have thought, you might have pointed to some of the questions around we hit kind of a wall in terms of the deployment of markets,
Well, from a legal perspective also, you're seeing other approaches being taken at states in terms of zero emission credits which have the effect in Illinois and New York of supporting nuclear power plants for environmental attributes. And there are, based upon work done at FERC, which defined renewable energy credits as being a separate attribute from the energy itself, defined by state law. It led to the growth of RECs. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, because if there's a bundled sale, then it still falls within FERC's domain. But anyway, the point being that there's going to be some interesting things kind of playing out at the what the NOPR does is very important, but it'll be interesting to see kind of how the issue plays out in the context of ZECs. What makes it different is, at least with the ZECs, there's an argument that the nuclear power plants are providing an environmental benefit, which I think is much harder to make for coal. And there is a history of recognizing environmental benefits. So that's something else. Does that answer?
Yeah, but and then I guess one kind of follow-up to that is just, you when you bring up the ZECs and kind of the nuclear state-level nuclear policies, it just brings me back to, do you think that the patchwork of different policies at the state level within markets is something that ultimately has to be addressed?
Ultimately has to be addressed.
We've been dancing around it for a long time.
Yeah, yes, it should be addressed. I think that you have a lot of entrenched interests in terms of the relationship between the utilities and the public service commissions, the politics of the public service commissions. I have a yes, it needs to be addressed. Probably not in my lifetime.
And I think it depends on what your policy goals are. The reliable electricity, I think the markets and the system now takes care of that. But if on a longer, US 10, 15 years, we as a country and as a planet have to decarbonize, especially starting with the electricity sector, the patchwork of state policies and state regulations isn't going to do that. It's working now for shallow decarbonization. We're 2/3 of the way to what the Clean Power Plan would have done by 2030. We'll probably hit that in the early to mid 2020s. But if we're going to get to deep decarbonization, which a lot of people think we need to get to 80% carbon reductions by 2050 or to zero by 2100, then you've got to get the electricity sector down to zero sooner. And I don't think that state level policy or local policy is going to get us there. I think there has to be some kind of federal policy, whether it's whether it's a regulation or whether it's a fee or a tax or something like that.
Well, why don't we turn it over? We have about 15 minutes left. Questions from the audience. And I think we probably have microphones. Yeah. So identify yourself, and if you can, keep it to a question so that we have time for people to ask a few questions.
Allison, I have a question for you. An independent power producer, one of those guys or gals from Harvard, if they have a power purchase agreement and the market price of electricity goes to zero, do they still get their power purchase agreement price? And the flip of that, which is the same question, when you have a power purchase agreement, do you
Depends
also
on how
have
good your contract is.
Pardon me?
It depends on how good your contract is.
Okay. So there's no standard contract.
I'm sure there are, but it's not my area of expertise.
Okay, so it's, okay. And
Part of it goes to, did you mark your sales price to the dispatch market, or did you do a standard, I'm going to sell it to you at this price no matter what the market is doing, what the real-time market is doing.
whatever it's that price.
Yeah, so
In some cases, I was just saying, in some cases that's important for financing, right? So,
Right.
I mean, I know it more from the wind side, but like, if you're going to get financing to build the wind, you know, you're a wind developer, right? You're sourcing the turbines, you have a deal on the other side, you want to know that you have a guaranteed stream of revenue so you can go out and
That's
finance
right.
it.
But the other question is, just a power purchase agreement is not enough. Is there also built in a transmission purchase agreement? Otherwise, the power purchase agreement means
you buy
nothing.
transmission from transmission providers under a variety of contract terms. So there's different transmission products. And
They would be firm transmission.
most
Well,
wind does
depending
not
on-
buy under firm transmission. Some gas plants do not. Coal and nuclear tend to have firm transmission. Some gas, not so much.
So
Most gas,
let's
not so much.
let some other questions. You want to hand it
Sure.
to the gentleman next to you there? Great.
Yeah, Stephen Barry, Chemistry Department. I have two questions, two issues that I don't think you've discussed very much that seem very central to us. One is the issue of the vulnerability of the grid. And I recognize that particularly because I believe there's one place in Wyoming where two grids are linked that's just simply almost next to the highway, completely open to anybody who wants to walk over to it and do what they want to it. So vulnerability is one issue. And the other is, as we move to more and more renewables, these are, of course, very time dependent. How is the evolution of the matching storage capability coming along to make the renewables full-time sources?
Well, I guess I can talk about vulnerability a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of vulnerabilities that the grid faces, including cyber attacks, EMPs, solar flares, physical attacks, like in California a few years ago. There's a good series of Wall Street Journal articles on that, a rifle shot transformer station.
Google Metcalf substation.
The Metcalf substation, yeah. And then you've got hurricanes, tornadoes, snowstorms, polar vortexes, floods. You know, you can just kind of go on and on listing the Moses's, best of. Yeah, so I mean, I think the utilities spend a lot of time thinking about that. They spend a lot of time building resilience into the system and building backup into the system. I think on the cyber front, the electricity system sees almost 50% of the cyber attacks in the U.S. on it. And you see examples like in Ukraine where the grid was taken down through a cyber attack. There's no one answer, but I think that it's becoming, it used to be where there was one person at a utility that would be thinking about something like a cyber attack, and now utilities have teams of people that are being more and more expert. The Department of Energy has put together a group of, to share information among utilities. I know Idaho National Lab, Oregon National Lab do a lot of work on that, and so I think there's a lot being done. I don't have an answer of whether it's enough or not.
On the topic of resilience, part of the job is anticipating potential threats, anticipating the breadth of consequence of a variety of threats, because you don't really care what caused it. You have to figure out how to do very fast recovery and restoration, and utilities are getting better and better at doing recovery and restoration and mutual assistance, at having spare parts, at having agreements and doing drills for recovery. The guys who run CenterPoint, which is the Houston utility hit by Harvey, had just a month before done a drill where they were doing a prior, a disaster exercise. They had 7 different scenarios. Harvey exercised 6 of them, which is kind of terrifying. But the good news is they knew what was, they had sort of started building into the DNA how to recover, so it wasn't completely taking them by surprise. Longer term, I'm deeply concerned about sort of my next campaign. Is I am starting to think about the implications of climate change for extreme weather and for utility patterns, and what this means for how we should be designing long-lived assets for a completely different set of threats that are significantly more severe. So I'm starting to talk to folks about what that looks like and what we should be doing, and I think it means a significantly different set of design and operational criteria for assets. The other thing that comes out of that is the importance of not taking buildings for granted, because our buildings were mostly designed, most of our energy efficiency standards for buildings and appliances were designed for 5 years ago, 10 years ago, even current conditions. And if all of the horrible predictions about the impacts of climate change are real, what we need is a set of building designs that protect us from the inevitable things, from all of the horrible changes that are going on. We need buildings and appliances that will enhance our lives instead of make it more dreadful when the power goes out. And that requires a significantly different mindset and set of planning and design criteria. And it's going to be a lot of work to get there. But that's, starting to talk about that now, and it's not a happy subject.
I assume DOE didn't want that part in the.
Well, that was not germane to the report, so.
I was just going to add, if you've ever lived in a place where the grid, the power is not particularly reliable or resilient, and you've got the financial wherewithal, you invest in generators on your own, right? You have a self-help approach to that. And so this is not exactly the same, but the investments in distributed generation, self-help, maybe not just for yourself, but your neighborhood, your local community, microgrids and things like that also seem to be approaches for dealing with these issues.
It is a given that when something happens, a lot of disaster preparation, we're going to pay for it in one of 3 ways. One of them is someone's going to anticipate it and you're going to pay for it through your electric rates. 2 of them is you're going to self-provide. Every time you buy an extra can of soup and an extra pack of granola bars and flashlights and candles and a battery and an extra blanket, you are preparing for the next bad thing. And coming from California, if you have a stockpile of water and food in your house to prepare for the earthquake, and by the way, you don't know what food security is until you do work in Hawaii and discover that there's only a 1-week supply of toilet paper in the islands. That gives food security and supply security a whole new meaning. So food is not the only thing you should be stockpiling. But the third way you're going to pay is through inconvenience. You're going to be sitting in the dark. If we're lucky, you sit in the dark for a short period of time. If you're not lucky, people are going to die. They're going to die at traffic accidents. They're going to die in buildings. They're going to die from too much heat or too much cold, or because their medicine went bad or their food went bad. And that's what's happening in Puerto Rico today and in a lot of other places. So we really need to get our heads around how to handle this whole set of issues much more responsibly in a socially cost-effective fashion, because just outsourcing the cost to you guys to sit around and suffer is not appropriate.
We have time for, I think, one or two more questions. Is there a microphone? Oh, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Chun Yu. I'm a PhD student at Harris School. I just want to ask a quick follow-up question about how we value the capacity. So as we know, a few years ago, a lot of RTOs, ISOs like MISO, PJM, they have the capacity market design to compensate for those generators. And part of their argument is that a lot of generators under their in their service area are not under the cost of service regulation, so they need something to compensate for their capital cost. But following your arguments, it seems that the capacity payment now is kind of like delay those retirements of those coal-fired plants that we don't need anymore. So what do you think about that argument?
I think capacity markets kept a bunch of generators alive that should have shut down a while back. I'm from Texas. ERCOT doesn't have capacity payments. We cleaned out a lot of those plants way earlier than everybody else did.
But you have I think the
And we
Texas
let our prices
energy-
spike, because by God, when something's more valuable, you ought to pay for it. But
Right.
that's a politically challenging situation that a lot of places don't want to do. And it's much more difficult to do in a multi-state market where not all generators have the same, not all regulators have the same clarity of purpose or confidence of reappointment.
But even in Texas, you have the energy market have some peak load pricing that compensates.
Well,
for those.
you can sell a lot of, you can make a lot of profits with a $9,000 cap.
Right. Okay. So from your opinion, those capacity market is not really important.
If capacity markets worked so well, you wouldn't have the RTOs and ISOs adjusting the formulas and the mechanisms every year. That's just me.
Thank you.
And we got another one here up front.
Katie.
Hi, thank you guys all for being here today. We talked a little bit, I mean, this is a big point in the report and then also in the discussion today, and that's the grids, needs to improve its frequency response when we're ramping up and ramping down. And I think Professor Berry touched briefly on this too, but do you see other states following in California and now maybe Nevada's footsteps with incentivizing the pairing of storage and renewable sources, or just requiring the utilities to install energy storage capacities on site? Do you see that increasing more?
Do you want to take a shot?
No.
Oh, okay. So the answer is states don't need to. PJM is incenting it through market mechanisms. California is incenting it through mandates. Different kind of incentive. But the price of storage is dropping so rapidly that it's one more thing that many individuals and businesses are self-supplying, because a battery, particularly an inexpensive battery, is a heck of a lot safer than a generator. Mm-hmm. And more and more renewables, wind and solar, more wind plants are putting in a battery to provide frequency response and essentially smooth the wind generation so they can sell a firm product rather than an intermittent one. And
gas, they're doing that with gas backup too, right?
yeah, you can greenwash a gas plant or a coal plant with storage or with, but the other thing is, I can, as I said, use the building as a battery. I can, with automation, put a PV unit on the roof of, do you have Circle K convenience stores here? Okay, so I can use automation to essentially, or a Costco or a Walmart, when a cloud goes over my PV units, I can bury that intermittency in the building. I can pre-cool, I can preheat, I can sync, I can stop the air handlers in the store, or I can dim a set of lights in the back, or I can sync a sudden ramp where the sun comes out and hits my unit again. I can sync that in the ice cream or the beer cooler. So I can essentially completely flatten loads. When when the automated car wash, a car goes in and 2 minutes later the blowers go on, that's a 25 kilowatt ramp right there for the blowers. I can sync that. If I'm running a convenience store, I can turn off the compressors and the air handlers, and all of a sudden I flatten the load completely. So I can totally use demand as a storage device. It's not just about turning up and down a water heater or a pool pump, although you can do those, they're the classic means, but there's much more sophisticated ways to do storage than just buying a battery. and automation and creativity are what's going to unlock those.
I think that puts us right at time. It's been an excellent discussion. I think not entirely what I expected. I assume, I think probably Rick Perry didn't know what hit him when the, when the whole discussion got started.
Thank goodness.
I was going to say, battle between two Texans.
Please join me in thanking our panelists for being here.